here. So I'm going to base this presentation on the assumption that you signed up for this webinar because you would probably consider yourself quite new to EU funding, and that you have a more general interest in the area. So this will really be an introduction, a first step. So if you already know quite a lot, then maybe there's not so many new things for you. Yeah, you can go ahead and change slide, Nana. So the EU funding landscape, we're talking funding for innovation at the EU level, it's really a massive landscape with a lot of different opportunities. At any given time, there are hundreds of open calls. So it's really difficult to present to a group that's probably not very alike. You represent different countries and different sectors and companies at different stages. So like 90% of the programs out there will not be relevant for each of you, but the 10% that could be relevant are not even the same for you. So the goals of this webinar are not overly ambitious. I hope to take you through these points here, and hopefully we'll meet these objectives. So I'd like to introduce you to something called the New European Bauhaus. Some of you may have heard of it, most of you probably have not. And then I will give you some insights into what's the target group for these programs, and what are some of the main programs maybe you want to take a look at. And the objective there is to give you an idea of whether maybe you should bother with EU funding or maybe you should not. So the first step in figuring out, is that something for you or not? And then, of course, try to direct you to more info and more help as the next step. And the slides will be pretty brief. There's not a lot of info on the slides, but I have some more comprehensive slides that I've shared with Nana and that she will share with you afterwards. So there will be more info on the different programs, for example, and some more links that you can find there. And for questions, if something I'm saying is not making any sense, you're free to just raise your hand and pose a question, or write in chat if you prefer. Otherwise, we can do Q&A at the end, so as you wish. Okay, go ahead then, change slide. So first, I wanted to make a connection between this EXCELVING project and the EU agenda, because as Nana just presented, this webinar is part of a project that is focusing on the habitat value chain towards healthy and age-friendly and sustainable living environments. So that's interesting, of course, because you represent quite different sectors. Some people work with building materials, some work with furniture, lighting, home automation, welfare technology. So it's really a lot of different competences that can all contribute to making better living environments. And that's great, because that's very NEB. And NEB is, of course, some complete EU lingo. That's the New European Bauhaus. And I wanted to highlight that because it fits really well with the EXCELVING project, and it's something that's quite important also for the European Commission. So we see it in a lot of funding programs. So the idea behind the New European Bauhaus is, well, the big idea is to be the soul of the European Green Deal. So the thought is that we have a very big job ahead of us to, well, renovate our building mass. We have to make sure our buildings are more energy efficient. We have to make sure that new buildings are more sustainable. So that's a big job that we have to do in order to meet our goals for the green transition. And so the idea behind this initiative that was launched a couple of years ago by the Commission is that when we have to do that, we should make sure to also leverage the competences that we have and where we are quite strong in Europe, to make sure that as we are greening our building mass, that we are also using our competences for well, aesthetics, to make sure that the buildings are not only green, but that they're also pleasant, that they're beautiful, that they support our health and well-being, that they're inclusive, in the sense that when we are trying to renovate or build new projects, that we include everybody who has a stake in the process in deciding how the layout should be, but also in the sense that the building should or the living environment should support diversity and of course should be accessible for everybody, for example, people with handicaps. So it's really to look at the green transition in particular in regards to the lived environment in a very comprehensive way. So you, since you represent some sectors that have different parts of this puzzle, but this could be an interesting thing for you to know, relevant thing for you to know, because it can be a platform for to participate in EU projects. That you have that competence that maybe can be part of a bigger project, because there is quite a lot of money being poured into this area these years. So this can give you another entryway. I'm sure you're already well aware of whether your product is sustainable or it supports well-being or health or whatever. So this is an additional thing that you can use to leverage your opportunities at the EU level, and definitely a buzzword that you might come across if you look into EU opportunities. Go ahead, next slide. So if we look a bit at the EU funding landscape and the opportunities for companies, the very key word is of course innovation. So we are looking for companies that have something new to bring to the market. So the keywords are innovation and novelty, going beyond the state of the art, and of course something with a bit of risk, because the whole reason that the EU wants to invest in private companies in these projects is, of course, to help take some of the risk that is associated with doing something new. So, so the primary objective or the primary criterion is to look at whether there is a good level of innovation and something very new is being brought to the market. And that's the market at a very large level. So if it's new in the context of a specific country, but it's already available in another EU country or in Singapore or wherever really, then in general it will be very difficult to get public funding for that. So it has to bring something really new to the market. It doesn't need to be an entirely new product. It can also be the same product but with a more sustainable profile, or the same product at a better price, or the novelty can be connected to many different things, but it has to really make a dent in the market. And then of course the next thing is about impact, because the EU is investing in these projects in order to generate some impact. Then that impact can be jobs and growth, and of course it has to do with also helping attain the EU policy goals for sustainability and the rest. So it's also important that there is a big market potential for the idea that you want to get funded, that it's scalable, because even though you might have a big impact, if it's a really niche area, then of course the overall impact might be less. So a large market potential and a scalable idea are also really important factors. Connected also, of course, with the societal drivers, that somehow there's a connection with the EU policy goals. The third thing to note is, of course, relating to the implementation of the project. So who's the team? And if you've been talking with investors or even watched Lions Den on the TV, you know that the team is really essential. So that's also a factor when we're looking at EU funding. It's really important to have the right competences in the team, or good plans of how to get them. And that there are complementary competences in the team or amongst the partners that you have in the project. And then the last thing to mention maybe is the X factor. I don't think that's a surprise for anybody either. More and more of the EU programs are not only relying on written applications, but also interviews or pitches. So you will start with a written application, but then they will invite the best of those to an in-person or online interview. So storytelling and charisma and big dreams and good plans and that little extra will also play a role in the selection of projects. So something I'm not mentioning here that could be mentioned, and I guess there are more things, but something that I know is relevant for many people is I'm not really mentioning the age and the size and the traction of the company as a criterion. It could be mentioned because indeed it's important in several programs, but not all of them. If I look at the companies that I work with, very, very many of them are startups, and many have very limited market traction. To give you an example, I've been working with a company in AI and healthcare, and they got a grant when they were just the two co-founders in the company, and they were not even full time on the company when they got the grant. So they got the grant. It was €100,000, and they quit their day jobs to do the project. So what they did have instead was a very strong idea that was built on research. So they had some scientific traction, not really market traction, and they had an idea that really had an interesting potential to become quite big in the market and to answer some clear societal need. This was related to COVID, and it was during the time of COVID, so there was a lot of political urgency in this area. And they had a team, very small, 2 people, but different profile and interesting profiles. They had PhD connected to AI and brain research and backgrounds as medical doctors. So they had a good and varied background. And one of the co-founder is also a really charismatic person who's has some very big ideas. He's really a dreamer, scientist type, but also a medical doctor. Maybe that helps that he's really good at looking people in the eye and explaining very complex things in an easy to understand way. So even though they were it was a very, very early stage company, they scored high enough on these things mentioned in this triangle that they had a shot and got the first funding, and they've gotten funding several times after that as well. So now they are a slightly bigger company, not big, slightly bigger. Yeah, go ahead and change slide. So I will just briefly introduce some of the programs that maybe you would want to take a look at, and it's just a couple of them. I put important programs, important with an asterisk here, because that really depends who you are, what programs are important. But these could be important in the sense that they're not sector specific, so they would be relevant for many of you, and they're going to stay for the foreseeable future. So if you press the links that I put in the presentation at the end, in 1 year's time, you should still get somewhere relevant. So in that sense, they're good to know programs. And if we start with the European Innovation Council, the Accelerator program, probably many of you have already heard about the program. It's being pushed quite a lot. A lot of consultants also work in this space. And the Commission sees it as like the one-stop shop for the best innovators in Europe. But emphasis maybe on the best. It's really for the top deep tech innovators. So very tech intensive innovations with a really market breaking potential. So if you are in that target group, this can really change something for your company, but it's a high barrier to pass. And that's why I put the arrow here on the right, that we start with something where the barrier for getting through is really high. But of course, if you do, the grant that you get would be very significant for the European Innovation Council. They give grants up to 2.5 million euros to a single company. So that can really change things for a startup. And I mentioned here they have this year a challenge connected to the new European Bauhaus, apropos earlier. The next program I want to mention is Eurostars, and that's focused on cross-border R&D projects. So since you are from different countries and since the clusters that have invited you are collaborating, maybe there could be some opportunities to do some R&D projects cross-border. So if you have a partner in another country and you are working on the same project and you both have a commercial perspective, you hope to get something commercially out of it, Eurostars can be an interesting program for you to take a look at. It's also really decent sized grants. It will be not in the millions of euros, but in the hundreds of thousands of euros. It's normal to get maybe 100, 200, 300,000 euros in a grant per company through Eurostars. And the last thing I want to mention is not a program, but a type of calls. So that's cascade grants. Some of you may be familiar with these. So that's EU projects. So the EU has given some money to a project working in a specific field like AI or something, to channel this funding onwards to SMEs in their network or beyond. And there is quite a lot of EU funding going to SMEs through this mechanism. And it can be a very good way for SMEs to get some experience with EU projects because the barrier for entry is generally lower and the grant will be lower. So it's a bit easier to access in that sense. So we have some really good examples of companies getting a lot out of participating in cascade grants. The tricky thing is that since they are the calls are awarded by different projects, the grants change all the time. So every week there will be new calls and new topics, and it can be very difficult, of course, for SMEs to get an overview of the opportunities here. So that's where you will need to get some help from somebody in the ecosystem that has a better time, has an easier time following the opportunities. And of course, I will link it later to a page that collects a lot of these grants where you can take a look to see if there's something for you. Just as an example, at the moment, there are many open calls. Some of them connect a bit to the topic of the EXCELVING project. So there is one called Sileo. So they're working specifically with projects in the lighting and furniture sector. So that might be interesting for some of you. There's another project called Pulsate that's run by different universities and research institutes that are very good at laser-based advanced and additive manufacturing. So there the focus is not on a specific sector, but on a specific type of technology. So if you are a manufacturing company that is interested in new technologies related to lasers or additive manufacturing, then maybe this can be an opportunity for you to try to get that technology into your company. And the last one I wanted to mention is the Create Thrive EU Eurocluster project, which is aimed at the European creative industry. And they give grants to companies active in that sector, even very small grants for traveling, also inside the European Union. So there are different opportunities there. The deadline is next week, but they will have another deadline later as well. So 3 examples, but it can be a lot of different things in the Cascade area. You can change. Next slide. So is it for you? Is this is EU funding for your company? And we can't answer that just based on the webinar, of course, but you can start maybe to ask some of the questions, the indicators that I will also look at when I'm talking to companies about whether they have good options or not. Are you an innovative company? Do you have potential to really bring something new to the market? That's a good first indicator that, yes, maybe you should look closer at the opportunities at EU level. Then, of course, consider how important is the international dimension for you? Is it a plus to collaborate cross-border? Is your natural market a cross-border market? Is it a positive for you to consider the international dimension, or would it be beneficial to focus on your home market mostly? So that's I wouldn't say that if you answer yes to that, then absolutely look at EU funding. It's more maybe if you say no, if then EU funding is not the right place for you to look. It's also interesting generally to look at you already have experience with smaller national regional grants in your home country. Well, first of all, that means that you've already made it through to get some grants locally or nationally. So that's an indication that maybe you have something that's interesting to get funded. Could be interesting to look at EU funding as well. It also means that you already know a bit about writing an application and administering a grant. So that will help you also in the EU process. And maybe also the other way around. If you haven't applied for national funding yet, maybe that's a better place to start. Of course, that depends also how much money there is in your national ecosystem to fund startups and SMEs. But in general, it will be easier to start looking at the national level. And among other questions, of course, how is your tolerance for bureaucracy and the formal requirements that are always there when you get public money for innovation? So if that's something you really cannot take, and I regularly meet companies that just are too bothered by this, then of course maybe don't waste your time applying for public money. I wanted to mention this one also because I know a lot of companies have the idea or the expectation that there is really tons and tons of bureaucracy associated with EU funding, and that's not really the case. There is some, of course. We have to have accountability for the public funds, but with the companies I work with, it's really not something they highlight as a big problem. They find the administration and reporting requirements to be reasonable. So I think if you've heard negative stories, some of them may be true, but many may be a bit old or connected to another type of grants. A lot of the EU grants that are aimed at SMEs have become better in recent years and have less administrative requirements. Next slide, please. So what's next? I would definitely encourage you to ask to speak with someone who knows EU funding well. Have a talk about your specific company to see if it's relevant or not, and if it's relevant, which program maybe you should take a look at. So speak with your cluster, maybe as one of the first points of to try. They might know something about the opportunities, or they might themselves be participating in projects that also offer opportunities for SMEs. So go ahead and ask them. And then, of course, speak with your national contact points. There are contact points for the different programs in all EU member states. And I linked to some of them here for the European Innovation Council, for Eurostas. And then specifically for Denmark, of course, if you are interested in EU funding and you have not yet spoken with your regional EU office, you should definitely do so. So I link here also to the 4 Danish EU offices, regional EU offices here. There might be something similar in the other EU countries, but I am not sure. So your NCPs are a good place to start anyway. And then if you prefer to read up on on this yourself, I put in some links for the different programs for the New European Bauhaus. They also have a sub page on funding opportunities. And then I link also to the EU page for cascade calls. It's really not the most user-friendly page out there, but it can give you a first overview of opportunities, and you can search on some keywords to see if maybe that could be something for you. All right, so that was my very short introduction to the opportunities. I encourage you to ask questions if you have some, including about the programs. I know I had to go through them very fast. I'm not sure which are relevant for the people who are listening today. So go ahead if you have any questions.
Yes, so you're welcome to write in the chat or to just raise your hand so we can, if you have any questions for Siri. Otherwise, I would like to start with a question. I was just wondering if you could say a bit about what is like the most common mistakes that you see companies are doing when they're applying for EU funding. I know it's difficult, of course, because it's different type of grants, but maybe if we talk about the cascade grants.
I think, I mean, there's really a lot of different places to start, but I think the very important advice is to look for advice, because I see frequently companies that for example, hear about the European Innovation Council. They feel like it's for them. They start the process, maybe even hire somebody to help them write the application, and they really don't have a good chance to get through. So they waste some time by applying to the wrong program. So as a first step, really always try to speak to some of the people in the innovation support, business support system out there, to try and find the right program to apply for. I think that's the first and an important place where companies can go wrong.
Thank you. And then we have a question in the chat. I don't know, Sakat, if you want to read it yourself or if I should do it.
Yeah, I mean, I could read it. So basically, I know there are different. Sorry, I turn on my camera a little bit. So I know there are different TRLs, technology readiness levels, required for different calls. But the three ones you highlighted, I was wondering if you have any info about them, so that people know as well whether it is applicable to them, or should they work a little bit more on their technologies before start basically spending time on
yeah. That's a good and relevant question. So EU funding, and I guess also national funding in most countries, is focused on what goes on before you hit the market. So in terms of TRL level, that would be most funding for companies will be on TRL 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ish. So it's a early development, first prototype, testing the prototype in a lab or simulated environment, iterations, improving the prototype, larger scale demonstration, all the way up to demonstration under operational in an operational environment, and then being ready for market. And I mean, in essence, there is funding at all these levels, but of course, different programs focus on different things. And I would say for companies and startups, you have the best shots at getting funded if you already have your first prototype. It can be an early prototype, but you have something, you can show something that you've made it some steps of the way yourself before you apply for funding. And something like the European Innovation Council is quite close to market, so you would have a prototype that you've tested already in most cases, and the funding would frequently be full-scale demonstration and all that is required in that space, going back and improving and so on, getting it ready for market. Eurostars instead is more R&D oriented, so you can have more back and forth also with universities. It's frequent to have university partners or other research institutes as partners in Eurostars projects. And cascade funding can be many different things. So some cascade funding is at a bit lower TRL where you're trying something out, but a lot of cascade funding will be TRL around TRL 5, 6, where you're testing some prototypes, for example, with potential customers.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you. And then we have one more question from somebody working at Bubble Bear. I don't know if you want to ask it yourself, or if I should do it.
Sorry,
yeah.
It's Anders here. Thank you for the presentation, Siri. Just according to normal EU legislation, we have the local funding where it's normally this de minimis with 200,000 euros, but I guess this is not applicable for the EU funding, right?
No, it's not. So de minimis funding is something applicable to state aid, and by definition, support given directly by the EU is not state aid. So we don't have to consider state aid regulations for EU funding. But that's a bit of a simplification. Are a combination of EU funds and national funds. So if we take the Eurostars program, for example, the main part of the funding comes from national funding sources. So there's a EU top-up, but the main part is actually national funding. So their state aid is relevant, and you might have to consider de minimis concerns as well. But in the case of Eurostars in general, you can choose whether you want to use your de minimis budget, your limit up to a certain amount, or if you want to apply under other rules. But no, in general, you don't need to worry about de minimis when you're applying for EU funding.
Thank you.
You're muted, Nana.
Sorry, I was just saying we had a question from Victor in the chat. Victor, do you want to ask it yourself?
Hello. Thank you very much for the intervention and for the presentation. Just a simple question, because as a partnership of clusters, EXCELVING is of course also intended to promote this EU funding. When the question was, when you do it, this support to Danish companies into EU funding, do you feel the need to search for, because there is that obligation of having at least 2 other countries involved as partners, do you feel that need to search for those partners? How do you do it? Would the EXCELVING partnership be a good contact point for this approach in itself?
Yeah, okay, thanks. So the requirement for partners in EU projects is there for a lot of the funds, but not all of them. So you always need to check with the specific program whether you need a partnership or not. For example, the European Innovation Council Accelerator, you can only apply as a single company. So you can, of course, have other partners, but they're not part of the project as such. And a lot of cascade calls don't involve requirements for partnerships. But you're right that for most Horizon Europe funding, you would need partners from 3 countries. And of course, it is part of the reason for EU funding is to fund transnational partnerships. I would say frequently when I speak with companies about these projects, they know who their best partners are. I mean, they have a really good grasp on who's out there, who's good for them to collaborate with, because they of course need to find partners that are relevant for their business. So they're looking at partners in their value chain. They're looking at tech providers, at potential customers, others that could maybe have another piece of the puzzle that's relevant for their product. So in most cases, my experience is that the companies have a good idea of who the best partners are. If not, then yes, we try to use our networks and the networks of our partners to find relevant partners in other countries, and that could be a project like EXCELVING. It could be through the other ecosystem partners that we collaborate with, like the clusters. And then we are also part of Enterprise Europe Network as the South Denmark European office. So we reach out also to other partners in the Enterprise Europe Network to find, because that's their core business, is to find partners in other countries.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, and we have one more question from Lise Philipsen.
Should I reiterate?
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm not so familiar with the programs. Thanks for elaborating. I just wondered if you could elaborate a bit more on what you said, that it's targeted companies before market.
Yeah. Yes, good question. I mean, it's pretty easy to answer in theory, but not very easy to answer in practice. Sometimes this concept, but the general idea is that that the funding is available for the development phase. So that when you're making a new product or a new feature of a product. So that's before that has hit the market. So once it's on the market, it must, you must see how well it's doing on the market. It should make business by itself. So it's in general, the funding will be for the development and the testing and so on, up until you have a product that's ready for the market, and then the funding opportunities greatly diminish at that point. Then of course in reality it's not so binary before after market, because many companies start testing their product very early, or they think they're ready for market, but it turns out they're not entirely ready for market, or maybe you hit the market but you have a success getting the first 10 customers, but it's not really what you need in order to make the product a real success. So you need to still do some development or some preparatory work in order to have a real shot. So in that sense, before market can be a bit of a tricky concept, but the majority of the funding is focused on R&D and development activities before you hit market. So of course you can be established on a market and still get funding to go in the market if you have a new product. Is that, I don't know if that's any clearer.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a couple of more minutes. If anybody have a last question for Siri. No. Oh, we got one in the chat. Martin, you can contact me regarding EU funding in Danish Life Science Cluster. Yeah, otherwise we just want to say thank you, Siri, for this presentation. I know it's difficult with a lot of different companies from different sectors and in different stages, but I think it was a good introduction to where to start and who do I reach out to and where can I find more information. So thank you for that. And yes, your Siri's presentation will be sent out to you afterwards.